Some of them sold millions of records. Some of them changed the sound of the whole world. But when the music stopped, the money was already gone. You think you know these stories? You don't. Bad deals, stolen royalties, habits that drained everything. Some of the biggest names in reggae history died with less than they started with. 10 legends, 10 heartbreaking falls, and number 1 will shake you. Number 10, Sugar Minott.
I've got my own hat.
Good thing going. Picture yourself in a Kingston yard, early evening. The bass from a sound system is already starting to rumble a few streets over. Kids are playing, someone's cooking. And from a little transistor radio on the wall, you hear this smooth, easy voice floating out into the warm air. That's Sugar Minott. Pure root soul, the kind of voice that made hard times feel almost bearable. Lincoln Barrington Minott, everybody called him Sugar, was one of the most gifted singers Jamaica ever produced. He came out of Studio One in the late 1970s working with the legendary Clement Coxsone Dodd, and what he did in that studio was almost magical. He had this rare talent for writing brand new songs over old rhythms, tracks that had already been used, and making them sound fresh. And that was something barely anyone was doing at the time. Good Thing Going was actually a cover of a Michael Jackson song from 1975, but Sugar made it completely his own. It hit number 4 on the UK charts in 1981 and became his biggest international moment. Here's something that not everyone knows. Before Good Thing Going got picked up for a bigger release, Sugar had already been doing serious business on the UK reggae scene independently. He was one of the first Jamaican artists to really embrace the UK lovers rock movement, and the British fans loved him right back. He understood the British audience in a way that many Jamaican artists at the time didn't even try to, but here's where the story gets painful. Sugar ran his own youth promotion label, and he gave opportunities to some of Jamaica's greatest early dancehall artists. People like Tenor Saw, Barrington Levy, and Junior Reid came through his gates. He poured everything back into the community. He wasn't just an artist. He was a lifeline for young talent, but the distributors who handled his records were not honest with him. He got cheated on royalty counts. He got paid for a fraction of what actually sold. A man who helped build careers, who literally housed and fed young artists, died in 2010 without the financial security his talent deserved. That is a wound in reggae history that never fully healed. And if Sugar Minott's story feels unfair, wait until you hear what happened to number 9. Number 9, Slim Smith, My Conversation. Close your eyes and go back to 1968 Kingston. Rocksteady is in full swing. The tempo is slower than ska, more soulful. The streets are tough, but the music has this gentleness to it, like somebody is telling you everything is going to be all right, even when it clearly isn't. That's the world Slim Smith lived in, and My Conversation was one of the most tender, emotional songs to come out of that whole era. Slim Smith, born Keith Smith, was one of the defining vocalists of the rocksteady era. He sang with the Uniques, one of Jamaica's best vocal groups of the late 1960s, before going solo. His voice had this raw, heartfelt quality that very few singers could match. My Conversation was recorded for Studio One and Coxsone Dodd, and it became one of the most beloved rock-steady recordings ever made. It has been covered, sampled, and referenced dozens of times over the decades. The Wailers did a version. Various sound systems have rocked it for over 50 years. That song has a life of its own. What's interesting is that for all the love My Conversation has received over the years, Slim Smith himself never got to see the full extent of its legacy. The song kept living and breathing long after his time. Even today, when veteran reggae fans hear that opening, something stirs in the chest. That's not a small thing.
All I need from you.
Slim Smith's story is one of the most heartbreaking in all of Jamaican music. He struggled deeply with his mental health. The pressures of the industry, the poverty, the lack of real support, it all closed in on him. He ended up institutionalized, and he died in 1973 at just 26 years old. He died with nothing. No royalties, no estate, no protection. A man whose voice created songs that still move people today. The system failed him completely. Slim Smith gave us beauty. The industry gave him nothing back. Number 8 had a similar experience of a man who named a whole movement and still couldn't pay his bills.
All right, C-Trends fam, let's keep it real. We're pouring our hearts into bringing you the best celebrity news and music deep dives. What? Check it. A massive 98% of you aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is how you can truly support us, helping us grow and create even better content. If you're vibing with what we do, take a sec to hit that subscribe button. It's free and makes a huge difference. Plus, ring that notification bell so you never miss out. Let's flip that 98% and build this C-Trends family together. Your support is everything.
Every story you see here takes hours of digging, piecing together history, and bringing forgotten moments back to life. If you'd like to support that work, you can become a channel member. It's just the cost of a cup of coffee, but it helps us keep these stories alive, and for that, we're grateful. Number 8, Alton Ellis, Rock Steady.
Better get ready. Come to rock.
Imagine you're in a small record shop in Kingston in 1967. There's a speaker out front pointing toward the street, and this song comes on a song with a slower, deeper pulse than anything that came before it. People stop, they start moving differently.
Steady. You got to do this.
Not the fast ska shuffle, something more soulful, more deliberate. This was the moment rock steady was born, and the man who gave it its name was Alton Ellis. Alton Ellis is one of the most important figures in the entire history of Jamaican music, and most people outside of hardcore reggae circles have never even heard his name. He literally titled a genre. Rock Steady wasn't just a hit record. It was a cultural signal, a shift in tempo, in feeling, in the whole emotional direction of Jamaican music. He was known as Mr. Soul for good reason.
Do it just like Uncle Freddie, if you don't know.
His voice could take a simple melody and turn it into something spiritual. He recorded for multiple producers over the years, including Coxsone Dodd and Duke Reed's Treasure Isle, and he consistently delivered quality that should have made him a rich man.
Just shake your head, rock your body line, shake your...
Here's something that will get you. Alton Ellis actually lived in the UK for much of the later part of his life in London, trying to keep performing, trying to keep connected to the music, and British reggae fans absolutely knew who he was. He was respected on the UK scene, but respect doesn't pay the rent. He passed away in London in 2008, and the stories from people around him are of a man who died in very humble circumstances. For someone who literally named Rocksteady, that is almost impossible to accept. Yeah, the cruel irony of Alton Ellis's story is that the movement he helped create made a lot of other people rich. Labels, producers, distributors, overseas promoters, they all benefited from the Rocksteady era. The artists? Not so much. Publishing rights were not understood by most Jamaican musicians in that era. They recorded for a flat fee or a tiny royalty and signed away everything. By the time the money started flowing from compilations and licensing decades later, most of the original artists saw none of it. Alton Ellis named a whole era, and he couldn't hold on to a dollar. Number 7 is someone you definitely know, and his financial story is one nobody talks about openly. Number 7, Toots Hibbert, Pressure Drop. You want to talk about pressure? This song is pressure. From the moment it opens up, you feel it in your bones. Pressure Drop is one of those records that sounds like it was recorded in the middle of a thunderstorm. Rawness, urgency, a voice that sounds like it came straight from a revival church in rural Jamaica and somehow found its way onto every sound system on the planet. That's Toots. That was always Toots. Frederick Nathaniel Hibbert Toots was one of the founding fathers of reggae music. He and the Maytals started recording in the early 1960s at Studio One, and they were so good that Coxsone Dodd's other young group, a little outfit called the Wailers, had to work extra hard just to compete. That tells you the level. Warp Pressure Drop was produced by Leslie Kong and became internationally famous when it appeared on the soundtrack to The Harder They Come in 1972. That film introduced Jamaican music to a whole new global audience, and Toots' voice was right in the middle of it. He won a Grammy in 2005. He was nominated 4 times over his career. Rolling Stone named him one of the 100 greatest singers of all time. Here's a detail that stings a little. Bam Bam, one of the Maytals' biggest and most enduring songs, the one they won Jamaica's first festival song competition with in 1966, was later covered and sampled without the group being properly credited or compensated. That song has lived on in dancehall, pop, and hip-hop culture for decades. The original creators left out of the conversation and out of the money. Toots spent decades being undervalued financially, despite being one of the most important musicians Jamaica ever produced. The Studio One system paid artists poorly. Moving between labels didn't always improve things. The reggae industry of that era was not built to make Jamaican artists wealthy. It was built to extract their talent cheaply. Toots kept performing, kept pushing, until COVID-19 took him in 2020. He left behind a monumental legacy, but the financial reality behind that legacy is something his family and close friends have hinted at more than once over the years. Toots gave reggae its name and its heart. But number 6, his story takes a completely different turn, and we need to talk about the controversy nobody fully explains. Number 6, Lee Scratch Perry. Police and Thieves. This one is different. Lee Scratch Perry didn't just make music. He conjured it. He was the architect, the mad professor, the wizard standing behind the mixing board at his Black Ark studio in Washington Gardens, Kingston, surrounded by mirrors, handwritten messages on the walls, tape machines running at all hours. Police and Thieves came out of that space. Deep roots, heavy dub pressure.
Police and thieves in the street.
The bass sits right in your chest. Junior Mervin sang it, but Scratch built the world around that voice and made it eternal. Lee Perry was the producer behind some of Bob Marley's most important early work tracks, like Duppy Conqueror, Small Axe, and Trenchtown Rock. The Clash covered Police and Thieves in 1977, and that cover introduced a whole generation of British punk fans to Jamaican roots music. Perry himself was a genius, genuinely visionary. He understood reverb, echo, and space in music in a way that was completely ahead of his time. He helped create what we now call dub music. He was an innovator at every level.
Guns and ammunition.
Now, we need to talk about 1979, because this is the moment that changes the entire story. In 1979, Lee Scratch Perry set fire to his own Black Ark studio. He burned it to the ground. His primary asset, his income, his creative home, gone by his own hand.
Police and thieves in the streets.
Now, there are different versions of what happened, and it's important to give you the full picture. Some people say Perry had been under enormous psychological strain for years. The pressures of running a studio, dealing with artists, managing business in a corrupt industry. Some believe it broke something inside him.
Scaring the nation with it.
Some say he was experiencing a severe mental health crisis. Others who were around him at the time say he had become increasingly erratic and paranoid in the months before. In interviews over the years, Perry himself gave various explanations, some mystical, some symbolic, some that suggested he felt spiritually compelled to do it. He talked about cleansing,
Guns and ammunition.
Rising sun.
about starting again. There are also those in the reggae community who point to the business pressures around the studio deals that went wrong, people he felt had exploited him, a sense that he had built something valuable and the industry had found a way to take it from him without him even realizing it.
Fire me gun on the street.
Which some people say the burning was his way of taking back control over something he felt he had already lost. What we know for certain is this: after 1979, Lee Perry did not have a stable base. He eventually relocated to Europe, first Switzerland, then elsewhere, and rebuilt a career almost entirely from scratch. He lived and worked in Switzerland for many years, supported in part by his wife Mireille.
Police and thief. Police and thief.
He continued recording prolifically, but the Black Ark, the place where so much iconic music was created, was gone forever. The controversy is this: was this the act of a man in crisis? A spiritual decision?
Hard meat, too much beef. None take my will.
A protest? A breakdown? The honest answer is we don't fully know. And anyone who tells you they do is not being truthful. What we know is that a man of extraordinary genius destroyed his own empire.
On Blueberry Hill.
And the reggae world lost something irreplaceable that night. Lee Perry passed away in 2021 at the age of 85. He was beloved. He was legendary. But his financial journey after 1979 was never what it should have been for a man of his contribution.
No one have me killed. No one have me killed. No one have...
Lee Perry burned his own studio down. That story deserves to sit with you for a moment. Number 5 had a different kind of fire he took on the whole system, and the system hit back hard. Number 5, Peter Tosh, Legalize It.
Legalize it.
Rebel music. That's the only way to describe Peter Tosh. From the moment you hear his voice, tall, commanding, unapologetic, you understand that this was not a man who was going to sit quietly and accept anything. Legalize It is defiant from the first note. It's a song that was banned from Jamaican radio. It got him in trouble, and he released it anyway because Peter Tosh did not back down from anything.
Don't criticize.
Winston Hubert McIntosh. Peter Tosh was one of the 3 original Wailers alongside Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer. He was there at the very beginning. He played guitar, wrote songs, and brought a harder, more confrontational edge to the group's music. When the Wailers signed to Island Records in the early 1970s, it was supposed to be the big moment for all 3 of them. But as the international spotlight grew, it focused more and more on Bob Marley, and Tosh eventually left to go solo in 1974. Legalize It was his first solo album and his mission statement. It was bold, political, and completely uncompromising. Peter Tosh's relationship with the Rolling Stones is one of the more interesting footnotes in reggae history.
Legalize it, yeah, yeah.
Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were genuine fans, and Tosh signed to Rolling Stones Records in the late 1970s. He had a duet with Jagger, Don't Look Back, that got mainstream radio attention. For a moment, it looked like Tosh might cross over in the way Marley had, but the label relationship didn't produce the financial returns or the global push that Tosh deserved.
I will advertise it.
Peter Tosh was murdered in his own home in Kingston in September 1987, shot during a robbery that many believe was not random. He was 42 years old. He died without having been compensated properly for his contributions to the Wailers, whose catalog was worth enormous money. He
Some call it Unpaid.
fought for his rights loudly and publicly, and the industry responded by marginalizing him. His militancy made people uncomfortable. Booking agents, radio programmers, label executives, they preferred the softer image. Tosh refused to soften, and it cost him in money and ultimately in his life. Peter Tosh fought the system every single day. Number 4 wrote a song called Money in My Pocket, and then watched every coin disappear. Number 4, Dennis Brown, Money in My Pocket. Number 3, Bunny Wailer, Black Heart Man. If you've never sat down and really listened to the Black Heart Man album from start to finish, I'm telling you, stop what you're doing after this video and do it. It is one of the deepest, most spiritual recordings in the entire history of reggae music. Mystical, heavy, like a conversation between a man and Jah with no filter in between. Bunny Wailer didn't make music to sell, he made music to speak truth. And Black Heart Man is that truth in its purest form.
I said don't go near him to get the Black Ark man children.
Neville O'Reilly, Livingston Bunny Wailer was one of the 3 original Wailers. He grew up alongside Bob Marley in Trenchtown. He was there at the birth of everything. He left the group in 1973 when Island Records wanted the Wailers to tour clubs in the United States that Bunny felt conflicted about on spiritual grounds.
For evil lions fear him to get the Black Ark man.
He chose his principles over his career trajectory, and then he built a solo career that earned him 3 Grammy Awards: 1991, 1995, and 1997. 3 Grammys, and yet the financial rewards of that career never matched the magnitude of what he contributed.
I said don't go near him to get the Black
Bunny Wailer was actually the longest surviving original Wailer. He outlived Bob Marley by 40 years. He outlived Peter Tosh by more than 3 decades. He was the keeper of the Wailers' flame, the living memory of where it all began. And he spent a significant part of his later life trying to make sure that legacy was properly documented and respected. He wanted the story told correctly. He was fierce about that.
Ark man children. For evil lions fear him.
In his final years, Bunny suffered 2 strokes in 2020 and 2021, and he passed away in March 2021. Reports from people close to him in that final period speak of a man who needed support, whose financial situation was not comfortable, who was dependent on the goodwill of those around him. 3 Grammy Awards, an original Wailer. part of one of the most valuable music catalogs in the world, and yet the money had not found its way to him in the way it should have. His family and supporters rallied around him, and the reggae community mourned him deeply when he passed. But the question that lingers is this: how does someone with that legacy end up needing that kind of help? Bunny Wailer gave us the roots. Number 2 gave us Night Nurse, and then cocaine took away everything the music had built. Number 2, Gregory Isaacs, Night Nurse. Night Nurse is one of those songs that wraps around you. It's late, it's dark, the bass is low. Gregory Isaacs' voice comes in like a whisper that somehow fills the whole room. Smooth, effortless, a lover's voice, a voice that made women stop breathing for a second when they heard it. That was the cool ruler. That was Gregory. And at the height of his powers, in the early 1980s, he was one of the biggest reggae artists on the entire planet.
Just to make it quick.
Gregory Anthony Isaacs started his career in Kingston in the late 1960s and built himself up with discipline and consistency. He started his own African Museum record label with Errol Dunkley, recorded hit after hit, and eventually signed to Island Records' Chris Blackwell's label, the same one that had taken Bob Marley to the world.
To the sick.
Night Nurse was released in 1982 and became his international breakthrough. It reached number 32 in the UK albums chart, got heavy radio play, and was used in advertisements years later, giving it a second life. He was hailed as the most exquisite vocalist in reggae by the New York Times. He had 27 number 1 singles in Jamaica. The man's talent was undeniable.
But there must be something she can do.
Gregory Isaacs once described his cocaine addiction as the greatest college he ever attended with the most expensive tuition. That line hits different when you understand what it cost him. He said it almost proudly, almost defiantly. That was Gregory. Even when he was talking about his own destruction, there was a kind of elegance to how he framed it. But behind that elegance was a real man losing real things.
This heart is broken in two.
His wife, June, spoke to the Jamaica Gleaner, and she held nothing back. She said that his cocaine habit drained everything. They lost a house. Cash disappeared constantly. He was dropped from his international label. He was arrested 27 times over the course of his life. Drugs, weapons charges, always something. His addiction kept him from keeping tour dates. It cost him his relationships, his credibility with certain promoters, and his money. And yet, and this is the thing about Gregory that you have to hold on to even through all of that, he kept making music. He kept performing. He kept showing up for the fans who loved him. He released new albums right up until the end.
It's a case of emergency.
He was nominated for a Grammy in 2010, and then in October of that same year, he died of lung cancer in London at 59. Broke, beloved, gone.
By the name of Gregory.
Gregory Isaacs lost a house to his habit. Number 1 lost an entire empire, and he did it long before that. The man who opened the door for Bob Marley ended up knocking on doors himself.
All right, C-Trends fam, let's keep it real. We're pouring our hearts into bringing you the best celebrity news and music deep dives. What? Check it. A massive 98% of you aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is how you can truly support us, helping us grow and create even better content. If you're vibing with what we do, take a sec to hit that subscribe button. It's free and makes a huge difference. Plus, ring that notification bell so you never miss out. Let's flip that 98% and build this C-Trends family together. Your support is everything.
Every story you see here takes hours of digging, piecing together history, and bringing forgotten moments back to life. If you'd like to support that work, you can become a channel member. It's just the cost of a cup of coffee, but it helps us keep these stories alive, and for that, we're grateful. Number 1, Desmond Dekker, The Israelites. Before Bob Marley, before No Woman, No Cry, before One Love was on every wall in every airport and hotel lobby in the world, there was this song, The Israelites, a man singing about poverty, survival, and the weight of being poor in a world that doesn't care. And it went to number 1 in the UK. It cracked the American top 10. In 1969, a song in Jamaican patois about suffering reaching the top of international charts. That was Desmond Dekker. That was the door he kicked open for everyone who came after him. Desmond Adolphus Dacres was an orphan from Kingston. He worked as a welder before music. He auditioned for Leslie Kong at Beverly's Records and spent 2 years waiting before Kong let him release his first single. But he was patient. He paid attention. And then he started delivering hit after hit. King of Ska, 007, Shantytown, Itmek, building a reputation as the most internationally successful Jamaican recording artist before Bob Marley was even signed to Island. He is the reason Marley got his foot in the door at Beverly's Records in the first place. Dekker introduced a young Bob Marley to Leslie Kong. Think about that. The man who helped give the world Bob Marley never got the financial recognition that act of generosity deserved. When the Beatles wrote Obla Di, Obla Da in 1968, the opening lyric, Desmond has a barrow in the marketplace, was a direct nod to Desmond Dekker. The biggest band in the world put his name in one of their songs. He was that famous in Britain at that moment. He was a cultural touchstone, and within 15 years, he was bankrupt. When Leslie Kong, his producer, his creative partner, his anchor, died suddenly in 1971, Desmond Dekker's commercial momentum died with him. He kept trying. He signed to Stiff Records in the late 1970s, a punk label trying to ride the reggae revival wave that was happening in the UK alongside the Specials and the two-tone movement. He made interesting music, but it didn't sell the way the earlier work had. And in 1984, 15 years after the Israelites made him a global star, Desmond Dekker was officially declared bankrupt. The man who wrote a song about poverty was living it. He kept touring. He kept performing at festivals and clubs and university venues because that was what he knew how to do, and because the fans still came. He was still on stage the week he died in May 2006, still working at 64 years old. Because he had to. There is no cleaner summary of what reggae music did to its pioneers than that image. A man who sold millions of records. A man who influenced the Beatles, the Clash, the Specials. A man who opened the door for the entire genre internationally. Working festival stages at 64, not out of love alone, but out of financial necessity. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story.